So we're on Samach Beis Amud Aleph. On the first line. Meitzer loy meitzer echad aruch, meitzer echad katzer. So we're talking about this next blot is going to be about when a person is not entirely clear in describing the boundaries of a field that he's selling. So the seller over here provided one, essentially the Gemara is generally assuming we're talking about a square. And he provided the boundary on one side of the square. If you look on the picture directly on the side over here, it means on the bottom side of this picture, on the bottom side of this field, he provided a boundary that included the entire width of the field. But on the top of the picture of the diagram, he only did the boundary he described was only half of the field. He's only kind of opposite the Kutzer side. That means we saw in the previous plot that sometimes a person has to give a boundary, but he doesn't have a way of delineating where the length of that boundary. So he just says it goes up to this point, like in this case, the Aruch side. So he said it goes up to there, but he didn't mean it to be a limitation or to expand to say that you own everything. I'm selling everything opposite that. The Kutcher side is the one that's relevant, and that's the one that shows how far he really wanted to sell. So in this case, he'd only be selling half the field, the part that's opposite the Kutcher. Amalev Kahana Ravasi Larav, Yiknik Keneged Roish Tur. They asked him, why are you saying that the purchaser only gets the a section of the field that is limited by the width of the Kutzer side, of the short side? Let's say both of the boundaries are true. He means both that on one side it's short, and the other side it's long, and there's a diagonal line between them. Why look to say that the long boundary is not precise? Say something that both of them are precise. Shasik Rav. Rav is quiet, which the Rashbam says means that Rav was masking to this svara. Zaktamar Umayda Rav. Now this Umayda Rav is a shtickle funny because Rav was already Umayda altogether. What it means is Umayda Rav, even according to the way Rav had originally said it, even according to that original shita, that it means that he only gets half of the field that's indicated by the short side. So I think there's a the way you look at it is, let's say the Kutzer side was, instead of Kutzer, it was Ruvain and Shimon, means the part that's where it says Kutzer is Ruvain, the part that's open is Shimon, and the bottom, the side that's Aruch, is Levi Yehuda. And he said, I'm selling you Ruvain and Levi Yehuda. On the side of that's Ruvain and Shimon, he just said Ruvain. And he left out Shimon's half. And on the other side, he said Levi Yehuda. When the Havale the Michtav le the Ruvain connected Levi, the Shimon connected Yehuda, like Kasavle, Shema Minok connected Roish Turhu, the Amalei. In this case, you don't say that he certainly can't mean half of the field, because there was no reason for him to mention Yehuda. And certainly he doesn't mean to say you get the whole field, because he could have said Shimon. So therefore, we say in this case, it certainly means he's trying to sell a quarter of the field. I'm sorry, not a quarter of the field. Three quarters of the field was the diagonal between the end of the section that's Ruvain all the way to the end of Yehuda. Okay, we're up to 4 lines in the bottom of Samach Beis Amud Aleph. Meitzer Ruvain Mizrach Umayr Meitzer Shimon Tzaf and Rudar. So this is, you look all the way down. This is I don't know how to indicate it. There's a diagram in Rashi, right, where Ruvain has 2 fields. It's about a third of the way from the bottom in the Rashi, the diagram. So it's a square. It's a square field. Ruvain is on the north and the south, and Shimon has properties on the east and the west. Tzarech lemichtavle meitzer Ruvain ruchen trin umeitzer Shimon ruchen trin. The seller, in order for the purchaser to get the entire field, the seller has to say, I'm selling you this property that's bounded by Reuven on two sides, and that's bounded by Shimon on two sides. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So the Rashbam explains what would be the alternative. He said, I'm selling you the property that's bounded by Reuven and bounded by Shimon. So what would happen if he didn't say on two sides? So Rashbam explains. Let's see the Rashbam. Mat meitzer Reuven mezer chamayr hamaycha sad l'chavev roitz a lift of mitzrev yesh l'shechna Reuven beis sadis achas b'mizrach v'achas b'mayr. Reuven has two sadis, one on the east and one on the west, and l'shimon shechna shtei sadis achas b'saf v'achas b'dam. L'yiklev le'stam sadis zush ani meichel acharei b'toich sadis Reuven v'Shimon. He can't just say it's in between the sadis of Reuven and Shimon without saying the two sadis of Reuven and Shimon. The asir l'mitli b'achas and kazet. In that case, what you do is you'd say maybe just between the two sides of Shimon, and then you cut it off on a diagonal. Certainly, if you'd say all three of the what do you call it, of the boundaries, that would be sufficient. So it would, if he hadn't said Ruch and Trin, we would divide the property into half, but diagonally, and we would say that it would be, I guess, it would be the right of the seller to say, this is what I intended when I sold it to you. Ibailu, siyam lo yasakronis mal. What happens if he just provided, the seller said, I'm selling you a property, and Reuven, Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda all have properties right by the corners of this property. I'm selling you the property that Reuven, and it's surrounded by Reuven on the northeast corner, Shimon on the northwest corner, and so forth. So the question is, do we say that those properties that are at the corners, those are intended to provide the four corners, and everything within those four corners is being sold? Or is he saying, I'm just selling you the properties that are directly in between the corner properties? It's a little hard for me to understand why it should be like that, right? If Reuven, let's say the four corners are Reuven, Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda. Yeah, should I try the whiteboard? Let's try a whiteboard one time. I know it's not going to work, but at least I'll know I tried. So I'm going to try doing it like this. This is Reuven, that's Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda. So the way the Rashbam says it, either he means, when he says those four properties, he means to do everything in the middle. Could you see my pointer?
Not in the bottom, because the bottom.
You don't see my pointer like wandering around?
Yeah, that I do.
Oh, you do. So the question is, does it mean to sell everything that's in between here and here, and everything that's between here and here? Now, my question is, why don't we say he means to sell them everything here, or maybe everything here and everything here? I don't know why we picked to say he's trying to say diagonal, like in the form of an X. I don't know where the indication is for that. That's what the Gemara's shaila is. Then the next question is, Kimin gam mahu. So Kamid Gam is like this. And he gives the properties. You make, oh, that's not going to help. Okay. I'm not good at this. I'm sorry. He makes properties like this. And there's one here, one here, one here, and so forth. So in this case, instead of just being at the corners, there's two properties around each corner. So it makes gam, a gam is like an L. So there's an L shape. So you're defining not just that there's one property at each corner, but there's two properties at each corner. So what do you say? This is all assuming that in the previous case, we assumed you don't get the whole field, because this is slightly more defined. In the previous case, you only had one property, here you have two properties. If in the first case you'd assume he only gets the X-shaped parts that include the strips that go from one corner to the other. What would be if he not only had the corner, but he had two sides of the corner? So that's more indicative that he means the whole property. That's another question. And finally, the last question is the Sirugin Mao. Sirugin, I'm not going to make the picture. We'll look at the picture that shows in the Rashbam. So you had, instead of having just a corner that the Reuven Shimon, let's say in the picture we have here, Binyamin and Reuven are not just by the corner, but they cover a quarter of the field, half of the width of each field. So you have going all the way around, the entire field is defined, but he didn't say all 8 of the properties, but he did every other. Siruga means skipping. So he did Reuven, then he did Levi, and then he did Yisachar and Yosef. So do we say that what he just said, I don't have to say the whole side. I'll say one of the two people on the side, and that will mean that I'm giving over the whole side, because on the other side, I'm also saying I got one person for each side. Or do you say that all he means to do is to provide opposite that side, and using the middle point of the field, so he's saying, I want you to get this is the width. Let's say on the first side he says Reuven. So he means I want you to have the full width of Reuben, but then it comes down to a point, and you only get the half of the field coming to a point in the middle. So that's the Gemara's third question. The Gemara answers on all these take. Now the Gemara asks the following question. He provided him with 3 sides, meaning, let's say let's do it like this. He does it like this, and he provides this side, and this side. But he doesn't give the top side. He doesn't provide the fourth side. Rav says he's kind of the whole thing. He just said there's no reason. Once I gave you 3 sides, you have enough to understand. You know the width and you know the length. So what do I need to tell you? The fourth side, who lives there? He says chutz meitzer. But Rav says the reason, since he didn't give the fourth side, what he means to say is, I want to keep the meitzer. The meitzer we've seen before that we said that the Rosh Hashanah used the meitzer. The meitzer means 1 row. So he kept for himself 1 row inside of this field. This part, the seller is keeping for himself. That's why he didn't mention this side, because he wanted to keep for himself. That was the indication. That was what his meaning was. Shmuel says he even gets the Meitzer. Shmuel says no. Like we said before, he just didn't bother saying that fourth part wasn't necessary, but there was no indication that the seller, by saying it in this way, was trying to keep something for himself. Ravasi says exactly the opposite. He says, when a person says like this and he leaves out that fourth side, what he's intending to say is, all I'm selling to you is this on the inside of this. I'm sorry, I'm not the best drawer with the cursor. That's all I'm selling to you. I'm only selling the inside of the of the field. The one row on each thing. What I'm saying when I say Meitzer Rishon, Meitzer Sheni, or Meitzer Shlish, I'm giving the eastern, western, and southern borders. He means to say I'm selling you those borders. I'm not selling you what's inside of those borders. Otherwise, if he meant to say what's inside of all four, he would have said the fourth border as well. That's Rav Ashi Shita. So the Gemara explains what is Rav Asi's reasoning. Savala Karav the Amashur Shai. He holds like Rav. Rav had said that what he meant to say is that he's selling everything except for the top portion, except for this part. So he agrees that Rav was holding on for himself. However, but he says when the seller is reserving to himself, he means to reserve even more. What he's reserving is the entire field except for the three borders. So those are the three shitas. So Shmuel is the most generous to the purchaser. He says he gets the entire field. Rav is and Rav Asi is the least generous, and Rav is in the middle. Amar Rava, Rava says he basically paskins like Rav that the middle shita that the purchaser gets everything except for the fourth, the boundary that was not mentioned by the seller. However, he doesn't paskin it like Rav because he has additional restrictions. That which we say like Rav that the purchaser doesn't get, the buyer doesn't get the fourth boundary, elderly mivla. That's only if the let's see how we could do this. If that fourth, that this row that was saying is not being sold by the seller to the purchaser that he's keeping, that depends where this line, the line that's coming, the ends of the property described go. If it's like this, I don't know how to do this. This is not going to work. I need this. I need a pen. If it's like this, where the property edges don't reach where the row is, if it's outside of it, then Itakad's not going to be. Then he's not going to be keeping it for him. Then he's not selling it.
Well, if it's not in the boundaries, then what's the finish? What are we saying?
Well, we're saying that he described a property that he's saying why? No, because he said I'm giving you, I'm telling you this. The real point is there were fields over here. So he said this field and this field, right? And he has also this. So the question, and this, I guess there's some way that we know that this is also a field. You're saying that with this, that's our question. What is this?
I mean, because he didn't include the fourth boundary, right? So now we're giving like but it's not even. I
guess
he never included it anyways.
I guess so this is what I thought when I thought about this. We've talked about how fields are defined. We talked about the base chia. So he tells you, I'm selling you the base chia, and then he gave these four boundaries.
Right.
But the base chia actually extended.
He only gave three.
I'm saying these three boundaries.
Right.
The question, and he has his own field that's here.
Yeah.
And this thing over here is base chia. Right?
Okay.
So the question is, does the base chia, where does it know? Where would it typically end? Where did it end until now? Now the problem with this is once he says it's base chia, it really wouldn't be relevant what the boundaries are. I 100% hear your question, but I think there must have been some way of indicating something that in addition to the boundaries define this as one field. And the question is how far that that field extended. I mean, depending on how far that field extended,
Mm.
that's
It's saying
that's. Let's see the Rashi.
it doesn't go all the way up, you mean, to the last field.
Right. The question is if this ends over here, and this
Right, I hear what
field
you're saying.
goes
I
up
got
to
it.
here,
Right. It extends all the way up. Then it kind of shows that it's inclusive.
right? Then you don't take away a furrow, a row from inside of what's indicated by the field. But if the field, if it's on top over here, outside of the boundaries of the defined field, oh, outside the boundaries of the properties that he has indicated when he sold it, then it's not going to. Then it's going to go to. Then the seller can keep up a row. Let's see the Rashbam on this. The loy amaron right over the muvla v'loy muvla things. The loy kana meitzer aviel the loy mavla b'toich shnei hamatzor shemikan mikan. Elohel pnei shneim kazeh. Avol muvla kazeh kana kol ma sheyesh b'toich hamatzor. Yeah, it doesn't really explain how that happens.
The diagram is pretty good.
Yeah, I mean, but what you asked is really a good question. I mean, the diagram to understand what he's saying is not so hard. What's the svara? That means why is this property in any way the property that's outside the boundaries? We're saying the loy muvla. What makes that's an issue here? Well, we're trying to decide whether this whole property, what's being sold from it. So the way he described it was by the boundaries. So what makes this part of the bottom field? We're trying to say, is this within those boundaries or out? But how is that part of the field? If he described the boundaries as ending here and here, why would we? What makes us think that that's part of the same property being sold? So, like I'm saying, there has to be some outside indication that
Right.
that's
So
part of the same
the way
matter.
the Rashbam explains Shmuel, the Haidalai Kasvei Mishum Delay Tzarech. In other words, it's not needed once you already have it. So if you're going with that Tzara, right? Then
Yeah,
since it extends all the way there, it's not needed. It seems like it's intrinsic, like that. It's just we assume it's just included,
it's just part of the field.
right? But since it's already not muvla, then you don't have that assumption.
Okay, but if I
Something
find it
like
a better
that.
shot, like that, because I'm still bothered by it. You're saying you're saying muvla, not muvla, but what
Yeah.
made that part of the field? Who said that he's selling that?
As I'm saying, according in Shmuel's reasoning, the way the Rashbam explains it, it's like it's just
Shmuel is saying that we include everything because he
right.
didn't have any need to say the fourth boundary because
Correct.
everything inside of the other three boundaries is what's being sold. But why are we saying that this strip would be included if not for the fact that it's sticking out? What made us think that it's being sold? Yeah. Okay. And he continues. Rava says another restriction, even though he paskins essentially like Rav, that he's selling everything except for this fourth side, one strip on the fourth side. And he said that if it's included, if that strip is part of the same section, that it's not included. It has to have a sufficient size, that row. Means I guess if it's too short to include 9 kavin, or if it doesn't have, if it's let's say it's if it's instead of being a stay lovin, a grain field, it's a orchard. It has trees on it. It has to have a row of date palms on it. But if it's not a sufficient size, it doesn't have one of those two things. Kana mechlal the chimuvla avagav dikala rifta dikla v'habi tishakav kana. So you see from that even if it has a sufficient size, like we just said, Rava would agree that it's not going to be kani if it's mitla. So you have to have, in order to be kaina, in order for it not to be con, in order for the seller to keep it, has to have both of those things. I'm sorry, one of those two things. Right. It's still going to be bought if it has one of those. Right. The seller will only get it if it doesn't have both of those things, which conversely means that the buyer will get it if it has either one of those two things, which we're going to see another pshat which holds the other way around. So now there's another pshat, another version of Rava, where he's saying like not like Rav, but like Shmuel, that you're kind of the whole thing. But like we said, it's just this is really just a starting point, and now he's going to further define that sheet. So now, since we're going like Shmuel, who says you are kind of the whole thing, he's saying, however, that's only if that last row is included within the boundaries on both sides. But if it's not balui, if it's not included within the field, he's not kind of. Even if it is, if that row is within the boundaries, that which he says that the purchaser gets it, that's only if it's not a sufficient size. But if it doesn't have date palms on it, or if it's not enough to grow 9 kabin. So so now this is much more. This is the other way around. This is favoring the seller. We're saying that it has to have both of these factors on the behalf of the buyer that favor the buyer in order for the buyer to be kind of that row. So it's interesting. Like we started off saying that this is like he's positing like Shmuel, who is more favorable for the buyer, but it's ending up it's really more favorable for the seller because we're saying the buyer has to have two factors on his behalf in order to be able to buy it. Where the first shot we had said like Rav is more favorable to the seller. We said the Rav says that he keeps the row, but it came out that Rav is actually more the Rav's version of Rav is more favorable in the end to the purchaser because he says that the purchaser has one of the two factors on his side. He gets that extra row. So both according to both versions of Rava, we certainly don't hold like Rav Asi, who said that the seller gets to keep the whole field except for a row on each at each edge of the three boundaries. But Shemina Nami, that if you don't have either of these things, according to both versions, that if it's muvla and is not a sufficient size, that certainly the purchaser gets to keep that row. And if it's on the other hand, if it's not within the boundaries, and it also has a size or it has already date palms on it, you're not kind of. So those are both versions agree if you have two factors in either direction, two factors favoring the seller, then the seller will win. And two factors favoring the purchaser will win. But mivla v'ekaleh, loy mivla v'lekaleh, if it only has one of the two factors, if it's mivla, that it is within the boundaries, and it has so that's mivla is favoring the purchaser, but it has a sufficient size which favors the seller. Loy mivla v'lekala, or if it's the other way around, the mivla part favors the seller, that it's on the outside, but it doesn't have a sufficient size which favors the purchaser. So that's going to be where you have the difference between the two versions of Rabbah. So what's the din? Shuda the daina. we're going to say that it goes according to the judgment of the dayanim, which we've had before. Shuda D'Dayin doesn't mean that they get to flip a coin, but rather what they do is they look at the circumstances, surrounding circumstances, and they do it based on that judgment. Okay, we'll stop over here. We'll start Rabba Bez Shem tomorrow.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
We could skip like the last end of the block.